Good morning, Tom. How are you this morning?
I'm doing great, Amy. How are you?
I'm really excited to be back with you to talk about the identity and leadership issues with family businesses.
Mhm.
Um, I think we need to tell our folks what we're talking about. So let's do that.
I think one of the things we wanted to do, we got such a great response from the webinar, is we want to do a series of short videos to answer all the questions that came in. Quite a few questions came in. So hopefully, the audience will find this useful. We want to be more practical and pragmatic in some of our answers, which I know is a high value for our audience and our clients as well.
Yeah, and so we're going to read questions about what we're looking at. And I think it's really important that we start with a summary of what we're going to talk about in this video. We had over 50 questions and over 300 comments. So what Tom and I talked about was, how are we going to answer all these? We can't obviously answer all of the comments and questions. So we decided we were going to group them by theme. So today's themes are what I call pacing between generations. And the first question is, how do we get the next generation to step up and take leadership roles? And the second question is kind of the opposite of it. How do you get the now generation to engage the next generation on decision making to teach the next generation, but without the now generation feeling like they're getting approval or opening themselves up for criticism? And I think you could change that to without the next generation feeling like they're getting approval or opening themselves up for criticism. Because whenever we are talking about initiating change or initiating decision making, the fear is on both generation sides. How do I do this right? When is it the right time to step up? When is the wrong time to let go? How do we get that timing correct? And I think that kind of summarizes what we're going to talk about this. Anything else you want to add, Tom?
Well, just decision making is going to be one of the major features we discuss. Before we get into that, though, the idea of mindset, I think, is really, really important to set up. We touched on this in our webinar, but I just want to bring it forward, is that there needs to be a mindset that this is an entire system, that whatever issue it is that we're talking about is true for both generations, but in different ways. So whenever I find myself, no matter what generation I'm in, I find myself thinking this is about me and my issues and my frustrations and what I want, then I'm really missing some of the potential solutions. And I'm really missing the chance to build a bridge with the other generations that are involved so we can do this together. So that's just the first kind of mindset thing I want to put out there, is always be aware that there are multiple generations' perspectives and they have value, particularly as we're trying to find solutions together.
And I think based on that, also a lot of our answers that we give are going to refocus each of the people in the conversation to look at whatever we're answering from that system standpoint, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's what
Yes.
you were just talking about. Does this slide impact your answer at all, or that comment?
Well, it's such a simple way of saying, look, here's three systems and they all overlap, and try to be aware of not only the generational dynamic, but what are those three systems are you standing in? Family, ownership, or business? And the overarching point is always remember that people have different experiences and are standing sort of, and this is figurative language, but they're standing in a different location as they ask the same question you're asking. So, quick example, when does succession and continuity, a transition of leadership and then eventually perhaps ownership, take place? Well, depending on where you're standing in this model, and depending on where you're standing generationally, you've got a different sort of set of wants and wishes around that process. And understanding that there's just differences is important. You don't need to know it all, but just start with the mindset of, I bet there's different perspectives than mine, and they're probably valuable. That's what I want to lead off with. But let's get in. We want to keep moving here. Let's get into the decision-making piece. When we think about the now or leading gen, the identity around transition of leadership and ownership is I'm the decision maker. And it's challenging for the leading gen to step out of that role, in part because they've done it for so long, but not just because they've done it. If the business has persisted and grown, they've probably done it well. And so there's something that they're bringing that's really solid. This isn't just sort of an ego stroke, but they're adding real value. And so they're concerned not only about their sort of, I don't do this anymore, but they're also concerned, well, who is going to do it on behalf of the organization? And what's interesting, though, is that in that conversation, the you're not ready that a now generation would say to a next generation can have elements of I'm not ready.
Yeah.
And just to be clear, older generation says to younger generation, you're not ready. But older generation would be wise to consider that maybe I'm not ready too. And that's not an indictment, certainly not a character issue. But again, if we're aware of these different moving parts around identity, then we can address them. Well, why aren't you ready? There may be some real practical matters if there's no one else making decisions at your level, and so we need to develop them. Or it may be that, well, I've just always made that decision and I'm really comfortable with it. Okay, well, that's another kind of a question, isn't it? And so then we solve that problem.
So, and I think when I work with clients, we really dig down into the why. I can't tell you how important getting under the initial reaction is in this work. Yeah. So, and also clients will describe to me, you know, I've asked to lead the board of directors meetings 12 times and I never get anywhere, but yet my grandpa tells me I need to get more involved in the board. Okay. So then we talk about, well, why do you go immediately to leading the meeting? Is there something else that would pace that a little bit easier for grandpa? What do you mean? What meets your definition? What's your vision of getting more involved? So some of that has to do with around the concepts of trust, being vulnerable to do those conversations, and then everybody ready to shift. And that's really what we're talking about, which is why we laid it out this way. So first you're going to talk about, am I willing to not be the decision maker or the leader on a project versus just the leader on the whole thing? And then how do we build the trust so that someone's ready to let go? How does someone become vulnerable to talk about it? And then really planning the shift, which goes back to the webinar where we talked about have a plan, right?
Right.
Have a plan, really have a plan. So I think that's really important. So that's the now generation. What about getting the next generation going? And I think we talked about just an apprentice or coaching model on this.
Yeah. Yes.
And that has a 3-step model. So you want to start the conversation about this model?
Well, stated simply, folks, this is really easy to do. Is let's say I'm the now generation. It's this simple. I'm going to do it. You watch me, and then we'll discuss. And then we're going to do it, and then we'll discuss. And then you're going to do it, and I'll watch, and we'll discuss. The now generation has an important coaching role to play. Remember, one of our main premises is the now generation still there because they've added a value for a really long time. And as a result, the next gen has some things to learn. But it's a both and that's where the trust and vulnerability that you just mentioned is really key. So when we see the now generation insisting that they're the only ones who can do it this way, or leadership looks exactly like them, then that sort of erodes some of the trust and vulnerability. So their openness builds the trust and vulnerability. So too, the next gen can also show up and build trust and vulnerability by realizing that sort of a level of preparedness, and then not needing to bring change just so they can, and I'm getting a little ahead, but so they can sort of meet their identity needs of, look, I'm bringing change, I'm bringing innovation. That the timing of that is critical, right? And so I was a little stereotypical there, and it's not always true, but the key is that how's the other generation thinking about it, and how can we create space? And this 3-step process is that exactly. Is at some point, in fact, you said this in the conversation the other day. I want you to share it. You show how people physically stand in different places. That's so rich.
So when I try to explain the process to the different generations, I say, okay, for the generation that's currently in the leadership role, in the very beginning, as you're mentoring or coaching or educating the people that are going to take over, you're going to stand in front of them.
Mhm.
and you're going to show them. And the next gen is going to stand behind you and they're going to observe. And then you're going to talk about what happened. And then the next step is to actually stand shoulder to shoulder with one another. And you make the decision together and you do it together. And there's a huge amount of trust that is built between step 1 and step 2. And the last is that you give confidence and you hand over, but not abandon. You stand behind the next generation as they're making the decision, and then you discuss. So they know that you're not gone, but you're still there. You're not going to take over. You're just there in case they need you. And then the last one, really, and it's not on the slide, is you let them go. And I think that's the hardest because it has the biggest identity transfer for everybody. But physically, first it's in front of, then it's next to, and then it's behind. And so the point is, it is watch once, do once, and then if you're a doctor, teach once. But that's really, right? So, I mean, that's a residency program. Watch once, do once, teach once, then you've mastered it. But here we're saying, watch once, do it together, then do it on your own with an observer and an assistant. So,
you were showing that physical standing. I thought of the phrase "got my back" and how
right.
the next gen can get the back of the now gen, and then the now gen can get the back of the next gen. And that doesn't mean that everything you do doesn't get some feedback, but it does mean that there's a respect and support and kindness. And that builds the vulnerability and trust that we talked about earlier. But let's talk specifically about some things the next generation can do.
So I think show up. Don't be afraid to show up. And first, listen. Listen a lot. Give respect, show respect, and then demonstrate your credibility. I think that's really important. Do you want to cover the next one, Tom?
Well, the next generation, as it says on the slide, demonstrates knowledge and enthusiasm, but at the same time, the now generation demonstrates experience and knowledge. And so one of the things that we find with our clients is when this is in competition and becomes sort of a proving match, then it's not useful because one of them always has to be right in their own way. And so it's the wrong question. It's not how can I be right? It's what's right for the organization. What's right for this process of transitioning from me to you or you to me. And so that's the slightest shift. It's really subtle, but that's where identity comes in, and identity and ego get interwoven. But if I'm trying to prove my identity or satisfy my ego, I am going to get in my own way in this process. And one of the ways to stay out of it is to lead with this kind of utilizing kindness, empathy, and compassion. So if there's disagreement, handle it respectfully. If there's feedback, if there's sort of innovation, right? Then how do we do that in ways that preserve the ego and identity of the other person, and yet we keep moving forward? Just a quick example, one of the dynamics we see a lot with next gen is they feel caught between a rock and a hard place, because on the one hand they hear, you need to sort of behave more like a leader before we're going to make you a leader. But then on the other hand, when they try to do leadership types of things, they feel like they kind of get smacked on the head by saying, oh, you're trying to take over the company already. And so there's this weird kind of now and not yet. And so one of the ways to get through that is to communicate effusively all the time. Ask questions. Hey, I've got an idea, but I'd like to talk about it with you before I start implementing. Does this sound like a good idea? I'd really like to try this out. It's an innovation. The other identity piece to run into here is now gen don't feel undermined or attacked when the next gen brings innovation. They should be. That's a great thing that they bring. Allow that, but have conversation and coach through it. There's so much in each of those statements that I made. I'd love to unpack them, but that's just a couple data points for you to think about, and practical mindset and techniques to use in real conversation with each other to make this go better.
So I think y'all that are watching this can see how complicated this work is, which is why people hire facilitators and consultants to help lead them through the steps that we talked about in the webinar. And those steps are make a plan. Next one, Tom.
I don't have that slide in front of me. Sorry. I didn't realize I was going to get cued. You take them all. Go for it.
Make a plan. And then after you make the plan, make sure you use compassion and kindness while you're doing the plan, and forgiveness. Get some great mentors involved, right, in that plan. So those are some of the outlines of what we talked about in our webinar. And you'll see that we provide a link for you to go through that again here. And we do appreciate your attention, and we would love to talk to you. Please feel free to call us or give us an email. Yes, Tom.
I raised my hand like you're supposed to do in a Zoom session. I see what you're doing there, and you were just redoing the 4 points of our webinar. And I think the last one is really important. It's don't forget the blessing.
Yes.
And that blessing brings me back to what you were doing so just wonderfully visually, is where you stand in the relationship and sort of getting each other's back. And the way the now gen can bless the next gen is to say, I believe you can do it. And the way the next gen can bless the now gen is to say, I'm standing on your shoulders. Everything that's possible for me is as a result of your work. Thank you. And that can be rich for everyone.
And I knew you could pull that slide out and you would remember that last one. So I gave you that home run tee up, didn't
Thank you. You're keeping me sharp. I appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody. We enjoy speaking to you, and give us a call if you need us.
Thank you. We'll see you on the next one.